Argentina is once again facing economic turmoil after Martín Guzmán resigned as the country's economy minister after a very long and very public spat with Vice President Cristina Kirchner. The markets did not welcome the news of his replacement, and the Argentinian currency is facing a sell-off. This is the Brazilian Report with LATAM this week. So to discuss Argentina's economic woes, we welcome Ignacio Portes, who is the Brazilian Report's Buenos Aires correspondent. Hey, Ignacio, how's it going?
Hey, Gustavo, good to be here again.
So, Ignacio, tell us what is going on. Who is Argentina's new economy minister?
Well, there's a lot going on. Argentina's new economy minister is like even maybe a sideshow to the whole story. There was a long, as you said in the introduction, spat between the previous economy minister Martín Guzmán and the vice president Cristina Kirchner, and his replacement is basically a person that Cristina Kirchner thinks she can trust more. And that's
the problem for markets, right? Because the reason Kirchner did not like Martín Guzmán was because of the deal that Argentina had signed with the International Monetary Fund, isn't it so?
One of the reasons, yes. Overall, though, she generally had a lot of objections. She wanted to spend more money. She wanted to not raise energy tariffs. There were several differences with regards to what to do with the economy. Basically, Cristina Kirchner is very concerned about the political situation of her coalition. She thinks, perhaps probably rightly, that they're in a losing position politically, that they are on their way to lose another election, the same way she thought about the midterm elections. She thought they were going to lose with that economy, and they lost. So she thinks she has been proven right, and they are probably on their way to losing again. So she wants to do something with regards to that, increase spending, subsidize basic consumptions more, and that kind of things. But Argentina has restrictions in terms of the deal with the IMF, and has restrictions in terms of its macroeconomy too, which is very damaged, very badly hit. So the margin of action that the government has is very small, but Cristina Kirchner still thinks that she can do more with a different minister, and she has been pushing Alberto Fernández for change for a long time. President Alberto Fernández, right, who she handpicked as the presidential candidate, but she hasn't been happy with him since very close to the start of his term. They have been in a constant tense relationship, and Guzmán was perhaps the most important man in Alberto Fernández's cabinet from the start of his presidency, and Fernández supported him for as long as he could, but he's been increasingly isolated and undecisive in terms of what to do. And eventually, again, as he did with most other ministers that Cristina Kirchner put pressure on, he also caved in on Guzmán and stopped supporting him on the kind of reforms that Guzmán wanted. And eventually Guzmán said, well, I can't handle this anymore. If what the things I want to do can't be done because Cristina resists them, I'm going to offer my resignation. And the way in which Guzmán did it clearly showed why he was doing it, because Cristina Kirchner was speaking. She doesn't speak too often, but she's been speaking more often lately, and speaking very publicly against Fernández. And she was in a public rally on Saturday, 5 p.m. on Saturday, like a non-working day. Clearly, no one was expecting much from anything else other than the rally. And Guzmán filed his resignation while she was talking, while she was criticizing the government. He tweeted a 7-page letter saying all the good things he thinks he did, the restructuring of the debt with the IMF, the restructuring of the debt with private bondholders that Guzmán did in his couple of years in charge, but said he couldn't continue in office because there was no political unity backing him, and he left. And he left a massive turmoil behind because there was no replacement in sight. Alberto Fernández kind of had an inkling that this could happen, but didn't expect it to happen at that moment. So there was no replacement ready. And probably the only person who had a replacement ready was Cristina. I mean, she was.
Who did she have in her sleeve?
Well, she had Silvina Batakis, which is the new minister. She is a person who has had some differences with Cristina. She's not of the closest circle of Cristina Kirchner. Batakis was a minister under Daniel Scioli, former ambassador of Brazil, when he was Buenos Aires province minister, and they had a lot of fights with Cristina when Scioli was the governor of Buenos Aires province due to resource allocation, resource distribution, that kind of thing. But eventually they made peace, and Batakis has been working under allies of Cristina Kirchner in the last few years. She has been working under Interior Minister Guado de Pedro, who is a close ally of Cristina Kirchner, and perhaps the closest ally of Cristina in the cabinet of Alberto Fernández. And this group of people have, despite some criticism of the government, as they are formally part of the government, they are not so open about criticizing Alberto as Cristina is, and they have formally backed the agreement with the IMF. So Batakis is not repudiating the agreement with the IMF. This is an important point. The agreement will not fall due to the change of minister. Although
but
perhaps
you have written last week that the post-IMF plans are already teetering, right? I mean, it's not
exactly
what is going on there.
Right. Perhaps even more important than the political turmoil, which is interesting. It's fun. It's like a drama, like watching a teenage drama on TV. Like if you watch Argentinian TV, it's a soap opera, really. If you watch political channels, it's Cristina apparently wants Alberto to call him, but she doesn't want to call directly because that will show this or that weakness. So she called this other person to tell him to call him. It's ridiculous. But I mean, that's entertaining, and it's relevant politically, right? Because this unity makes managing the economy much harder. But there's a macroeconomic problem behind that is more structural and harder to solve. Yes, I wrote a story last week before all this political
mess.
Mess. That before all this mess disentangled, finally on the weekend, we published on Thursday or Friday that the IMF deal was already showing. I mean, Alberto Fernández's plans to try to keep the economy in line with the IMF deal were struggling because the IMF deal establishes a series of targets that Argentina has to meet quarterly, and the IMF does quarterly revisions, as it does with any country that to which it gave a loan. And the quarterly revisions establish inflation targets, growth targets, fiscal deficit targets, spending targets, blah blah blah. And the IMF is willing to be flexible on many of these targets, right? Because, well, it knows that Argentina's economy is in trouble. Politically, it knows that the loan is very big. And the IMF would look extremely foolish if it failed again. The IMF has already failed many times with Argentina, has offered plans that didn't work. This loan was made in a pretty irregular way. So the IMF it doesn't want to show that the plan failed, right? So it's willing to be flexible. And it also says, okay, there's been war in Ukraine, there's been a pandemic, there's some wiggling room, right? But there's one aspect in which they cannot or they do not want to be very flexible, which is the accumulation of foreign reserves or foreign currency reserves in Argentina's central bank, because that is what Argentina needs to pay back the IMF. So that target is only barely negotiable, right? So the problem is Argentina has been struggling to accumulate these reserves. Despite the rise in commodity prices, Argentina exports soybean, exports wheat, exports beef, and that kind of agricultural products that have been rising in price since late 2020, and a little bit more with the war in Ukraine. But it also imports a lot of energy, because it's not that Argentina doesn't have energy, but it has some new gas fields that it has struggled to connect to the rest of the country. The infrastructure needed to use that gas is not developed. It's not, the gas fields are not connected with Buenos Aires, with Cordoba, with the industrial centers of Argentina, with the residential centers of Argentina. So Argentina is importing massive amounts.
Where the lion's shares of the population is living.
Right. And of consumption, right? Because it's the richest places, the places with more industry. So and it's been a cold winter, and the energy prices are very high, and Argentina is importing massive amounts of energy. Also, tariffs are very cheap, so people are consuming because it's not very expensive. So yeah.
No, and I mean, besides the energy, you live in Buenos Aires. Can you tell us what is like a trip to the market there? Because inflation is set to top 60% a year, right?
Right. Yes. Yes. So, but let me. I will address that. But let me wrap up this. So the problem is that the dollars that Argentina was finding through exporting their grains are going, most of them, through importing energy, and so they don't have enough dollars accumulated to pay the IMF. So Argentina last week, basically to meet the targets, Guzmán in his last week in office decided to basically close off all imports. In a desperate move, and Argentina finally accumulated some reserves, but you cannot live closing off all imports. It's insane. So the companies are already in a panic mode. They are withholding stock. They don't want to sell their products because they don't know how they will replace them. Like there's spare parts, machinery, goods of all kinds, construction materials, whatever. So there was lots of uncertainty last week about what to do with the everyday economy, right? Because Argentina was taking these extreme measures to accumulate some dollars to meet the quarterly targets that the IMF set in terms of accumulate some dollars, because the quarter just ended, right? The end of June was last week. So Guzmán barely managed to meet the requirements of reserve accumulation, but it doesn't seem, the path that he needed to get there doesn't seem sustainable. And Batakis, his replacement, will be faced with the same problem, coupled with, as you say, inflation, massive debts in terms of not just the international debt, but local debts in pesos. So she will be facing massive problems. And as you say, in terms of inflation, it's not just that Argentina has problems to repay its debt, but also has a social problem accumulating, because Argentina is seeing record inflation rates since the hyperinflation, right? Since the 1990 second hyperinflation that Argentina saw,
that we all saw in South America.
We all saw in South America, Peru, Brazil, everyone saw it. Argentina is currently at 60-65% inflation in the last 12 months, but forecasts suggest that it will be higher. As I was saying, Argentina has the treasury has a massive peso debt that it's struggling to renew, it's struggling and to repay it. It will need to print a lot of pesos to pay the holders of that debt, which would add more pressure to inflation. And it also has a fiscal deficit, and that it needs to. I mean, the only way to finance it is printing it at this moment. So, I mean, the prognosis is that Argentina will have probably 70, 80, maybe we'll reach 100% inflation at some point this year, next year. Although this massive constriction of imports is also likely to cause a recession. So there are some factors that could bring inflation, also help bring inflation down a little bit, though not in a good way, right? But because of a recession, Argentina has been growing after the pandemic, but this kind of brutal restriction of imports there's no way this doesn't contract the economy significantly. So
no, and for instance, the inflation rate, as we always say, is it tells us a lot about the state of the economy, but it doesn't tell us everything, because inflation rates vary from household to household. It all depends on what you're buying, right? That's why, for instance, in Brazil, we say inflation is more punitive to poor people, especially when it's more concentrated on food prices, energy prices, essential goods that people cannot live without. In Argentina, is there specific kind of products where inflation is more concentrated?
It's been similar than what you're describing in Brazil. Food has seen higher inflation. Energy has, I mean, the thing with energy is there's subsidies. So it's not the same as Brazil. There's very strong energy subsidies in Argentina. So it's not exactly the same, but definitely food has been rising faster than average inflation. Also, some protected industries such as clothing have been rising faster because there's no foreign competition, and they've been raising prices throughout the pandemic. But yes, food definitely, and food is an essential part of a poor man's basket of goods, right? So it's definitely hitting the poor more. There are some subsidies to the poor that try to compensate that, but Guzmán has been tight-fisted with this, and this has been one of the reasons for contention with Cristina, right? During the pandemic, the government created these subsidies that every country created some subsidies, right, to protect the poor and the informal workers and the companies that were struggling, etc., through the closure of the economy, especially the countries that closed the economy significantly, like Argentina did. And
it was the world's longest lockdown for some time, right?
At some point, it probably was. Yeah. It was pretty strong, especially the first year. The second year, it was more lax, but the first year was pretty strong until they realized that economically they couldn't sustain it. But the reason why they couldn't sustain it, especially, was that Guzmán was being very tight-fisted with regards to these subsidies. He obviously at first he said, okay, it's an emergency, let's give some subsidies to the poor. But they only did 3 installments of this IFE subsidy. It's just the acronym, it doesn't matter. But it was basically a subsidy for the low-income people, informal workers, that kind of thing. Not a big subsidy either, it's just subsistence level stuff. And they only did it 3 times for 3 months. And in a very delayed, spaced out way, like more like Guzmán was obviously thinking more about the fiscal deficit than about the situation of people without jobs or with struggling with higher food prices or whatever. So it was. Argentina had to, or Guzmán decided to, because of the fragile situation of Argentina's macroeconomic, decided to tighten his spending at the time when Argentina most needed some spending, and obviously this had electoral consequences for the country, and Cristina has been very angry with Guzmán for that and for other reasons, but you can definitely see both sides of the argument here.
And Argentina is going to depose next year, right? So do you think there's enough time for Alberto Fernández to turn his fortunes around and become more competitive for a re-election bid? Because at this point, we are seeing, as you have written, Javier Milei in the far right taking some hits. The left, the Peronism, as you also write for the Brazilian Report, is in shambles. And then you have kind of former President Mauricio Macri just kind of standing there and trying not to do anything dumb in order to profit from other forces' misfortunes.
Yeah, at the moment, it's the opposition's game to lose, right? The government is in shambles, and it's dragging all of Peronism, not just left-wing Peronism. They created a broad coalition. It's called Frente de Todos, like front of everyone. So every Peronist or most Peronist factions that were divided got together.
And every Peronist is a lot of people in Argentina, right? From all sides of the political spectrum.
Right, correct. Yes, even people like Sergio Massa, who is more of he's the guy that defeated Cristina in 2013 when the government was very dominant, very hegemonic. Massa, with a more right-wing platform, like saying like Cristina is going to turn us into Venezuela. He defeated him, and now they're together. And he was one of the candidates to be, or some of his people to be economy minister this weekend, but in the end, Cristina won. Anyway, all these people are together in the same coalition. So Massa is going to take hits. It's taking hits. His image, his public image is very low. Cristina's image is very low. None of them have public images above 35% when you look at pollsters, and they have very high negative image. So in a run-up, they would all suck if they even get there. And meanwhile, the opposition had some problems, as you said, with Milei, who was possibly a vote splitter, right? He could steal some votes from the right, and Peronism was kind of enthusiastic about this possibility. But Milei is struggling at the moment. He's been looking like a fool on TV for the last couple of months, saying that organ selling is not so bad because it's just a free market. So He is
And justify that by saying "my body, my rules," right? Which adds a new level of.
he is pro-choice in market selling, in organ selling, but he is pro-life in terms of abortion, by the way.
Very coherent.
Yes. Anyway, the center right is at the moment has the initiative, and the question really is it Macri, the previous president, who could probably, I mean, he has an opening for winning again, despite having had a disastrous ending to his presidential term last time around, or is it maybe Horacio Rodríguez Larreta, the more centrist mayor of Buenos Aires City? So that feels like the real competition right now is going to be, is it Macri or Larreta who wins the opposition internal fight to be the candidate? Do they make some kind of agreement, or do they go to an internal election? And eventually, what happens? I mean, yeah, that seems to be the picture right now. You cannot rule out Peronism. The right-wing vote could still be divided. Macri still has a lot of negative image due to his last period in charge. So I don't want to rule out Peronism. Lots of people had done it across history and been proven wrong. So, but clearly the opposition has the advantage right now, and especially because the economy doesn't look like it's going to improve, right? At the moment, it all feels like it's barely being held together with duct tape, right? The multiple exchange rates, the rules are getting increasingly complex in terms of what you can import, what you cannot import, the multiple markets for everything, the black markets. It's all increasingly chaotic, and the inflation doesn't seem to be possible to contain, despite the government saying that it will. I mean, trying desperately to do something about it. It doesn't look like there's a lot to do in the short term to contain it. So the economy is really conspiring against the government.
Just for the sake of comparison, between now and the early 2000s, when you had like presidents just revolving door at the Casa Rosada because of economic problems, inflation now as compared to then is what is the relation?
Inflation is much higher, because Argentina was in the 2001 crisis. Argentina was coming out of the convertibility, right? The $1 $1 peg, so inflation was close to zero. Yeah, near zero for a lot of time. In the aftermath of when we exited the peg of the peso to the dollar, it went higher, but it went to 6 to 10 to 15. Never something like what it's been going steadily upward since then, right? Deficits has been increasing, then debt started to increase, then to pay your debts you have to print more money, and it's been but the problems the structural problems are never fixed. So it's been getting increasingly higher inflation. But in terms of the crisis, the level of crisis, I don't think we've seen something as bad as 2002 yet. We might see it, but poverty is at the moment, in the last measurement, at 37%, the official measurements. I think if you update it, it's probably like with inflation in the last few months, it would be closer to 40. But Argentina saw closer to 50% poverty in 2002. So we've seen worse, but the amount of structural problems that have been accumulating means that the crisis could get as bad as 2001 in terms of human suffering. It's a different kind of crisis. It's an inflationary crisis. It's not a bank run. It's not a deflationary crisis. But politically and in terms of human suffering, it's possible that it gets as bad as that. It's possible.
Well, Ignacio, thank you very much for explaining to us what's going on. And it's always very complicated, but you nailed it. Thank you, man.
Thank you. Glad to be here. Bye-bye.
And for our people who are watching this video, please subscribe to the Brazilian Report, which is the journalistic engine behind all of our content, our website articles, our YouTube channel, and our podcast. If you are already a subscriber, go to Buy Me a Coffee, and you can donate a cup of coffee to one of our journalists, or you can become a member and have exclusive perks like made-for-you newsletters, take a look behind the scenes and see how the sausage is done. You can go to buymeacoffee.com/Brazilian Report. Thank you very much. And Ignacio, thank you again. Gracias.
Good to be here. Bye, Gustavo.